Isidor and Ida Straus were one of America's wealthiest couples, and their death shook the Western world. How did Ida die? And what precious object was recovered after the sinking? And what was the relationship between George Rosenshine and Gertrude Maybelle Thorne? And then there is the story of the Addergoole 14, traveling to America to find a new life on the steamship RMS Titanic. Will they survive? All this on Titanic, Stories from the Deep. The wreck of RMS Titanic was discovered 3,800 meters deep in the Atlantic Ocean. Over 5,500 artifacts and personal items have since been recovered, all reminders of the passengers and crew who set sail that fateful day. These objects tell very real stories of love, survival, mystery, and fate. This is Titanic, Stories from the Deep. She was the largest and most opulent ocean liner of the time. Launched in 1912, the White Star Line built Titanic not for speed, but for luxury. Travel in each of the three classes was above and beyond that on any other ship. Third-class passengers, most of whom were immigrants on their way to America, enjoyed better food and better beds than they had ever known in their lives. On the other end of the scale, the opulence of first class was unparalleled for ships of that era. What did these two classes have in common? Love. Love for one another, love of family, love that lasts to this very day. When Titanic struck the iceberg and the call came to abandon ship, it was women and children first. In first class, there were 144 women. They had the best chance of survival. Their cabins were closer to the lifeboats, and their status gave them extra consideration from the crew. And yet, 4 women from first class died that April night, including Ida Straus. Ida Straus was the wife of well-known American businessman Isidor Straus. She clearly would have been offered a place in a lifeboat. So why did she die? To understand her death, we must first understand her life and the love story of Ida and Isidor Straus.
They both were born in Germany and came here as young children. They met when they were sort of set up by those who felt that they might be compatible, and pretty much from the very beginning, they developed a fondness for one another.
Isidor and Ida were, I think, really an extraordinary and unusual couple. Their relationship was one of total devotion, always. We have 3 boxes filled with letters. Every time they were separated, they wrote letters every single day. And it's so clear that their admiration for one another, their love for one another, their partnership was extraordinary, especially for that time. It was really the Victorian era, and people did not write about sexuality, about sex. And yet we have one letter that Ida expresses to Isidor that she's excited that their being apart is about to be over and that they can resume their lovemaking, that she was looking forward to a time when they can be intimate together. This is very, very unusual for that period.
I am rather late for the mail again. We do so much talking all morning, and I have exceptionally deferred my most pleasant duty to the last minute. I am so glad our imaginary lovemaking will soon be at an end, and that we will not require writing paper as our intermediary anymore. Your devotedly, Mama.
They really cherished one another. I know that's kind of an old-fashioned thing to say, but I think it's suitable. Theirs was, in fact, a love story, because I think they really set a model for those of us who are among their descendants.
Isidor was a merchant. He was an owner of Macy's, along with his brother, Nathan. Isidor was always known as Mr. Isidor, and he knew every single one of his employees by name. The employees were very fond of him and very grateful for this wonderful job. They treated them very well. At Macy's, they had the first mutual aid society. They had the first doctor and nurse on premises for their employees. Isidor was a friend to many presidents, but also a consultant. He did many, many things. In 1911, they still had a lot of family, both of them, in Germany. And so they decided that they were able to take a winter abroad. Then when it was getting to be early April, they were starting to feel it was time to come home. But there was a coal strike going on at that time.
Because of the coal strike, White Star Line diverted coal and passengers from other ships, so Titanic could make her maiden voyage as scheduled on April 10th, 1912.
So really the reason they were on Titanic is because it was one of the only ships going at that point. When they got to the ship, Ida wrote a thank you letter. And we have that letter, which is on Titanic stationery, and it is the last letter that she wrote. It describes the ship. She says, oh, what a ship. These aren't really cabins. These are wonderful rooms, this suite of rooms that we have, and they're so lovely. And then the letter was mailed in Cherbourg, where Titanic stopped to drop off mail, pick up food and supplies and other passengers. And so we have this letter with such a wonderful description of the surroundings.
Titanic was a three-class system. You had the upper class traveling in first, you had the middle class traveling in second, and you had immigrants traveling in third. The White Star Line, her owners, had realized that speed was kind of a dead end. So what happened was the White Star Line said, let's concentrate on luxury. And so when the Olympic and Titanic and the Britannic were all designed, the emphasis was on spaciousness, elegance, refinement of design, and novelty in amenities.
There was a style to traveling in first class, with many passengers bringing their servants and a complete wardrobe so that their dress would suit the elegance of their seagoing surroundings. Some of the artifacts recovered and conserved from the debris field surrounding Titanic reveal fascinating details about the people who were on board and their standard of dress while on Titanic.
So we have a man's collapsible top hat. Right now there's a support that keeps it in this position as we're showing it for exhibitions as well as for the safety and travel with the textiles. Once we get the saline out, once we get all the salt out, we want to make sure there are no other impurities in there. So for example, in the debris field, you have a lot of the metal corrosive bacteria. That's what's destroying the Titanic at this time. And you can look at some of the textiles that have been conserved and kind of get an idea just by looking at them, how close they were to all of that metal that was rusting. This is made of primarily silk. What we have on the top of the hat right now is this discoloration, and this has been in close proximity to the rust that's breaking down the metal of the Titanic and has weeped onto the fabric, causing degradation. Another good reason for having the mount on the inside to give it support so it doesn't put pressure on these weak threads. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed, making sure that bacteria is gone. So this is the liner that was inside the hat that tells where the hat came from. All right, so the label from the inside is Herbert Johnson, 38 New Bond Street in London.
An exclusive shop in London, likely frequented by a wealthy first-class passenger, although we do not know this for sure, or indeed who the hat actually belonged to.
First class were kept in the luxury to which they had become accustomed. Even though they had the best of everything and all they could possibly want, keeping them happy for 4 or 5 days on an ocean liner could be a little bit of a task. I think also something needs to be said for third class. This was not exactly a vacation for third class, but it was as close as they were probably going to get. You didn't have to get up at 4 a.m. and milk the cows. It was a different world.
The story of Titanic is, to some degree, the story of the worldwide immigration that took place in the early 20th century as the world economy shifted from agriculture to industry. While first and second class received most of the attention, Titanic was also built to carry immigrants who were dreaming of a better life in America. This was especially true for the many Irish who were leaving their country in droves. This trinket, painted with shamrocks, was found in Titanic's debris field. It's believed to be a keepsake of Ireland, a memory for someone who recently traveled there or something a young girl might carry with her to remind her of her Irish homeland. This artifact will travel with Alex Klingelhofer to Ireland and the small country parish of Addergoole, where over 100 years after the sinking of Titanic, a memorial is still held every April 15th.
Well, in the early 1900s, they had just got over the most terrible century we've ever had, when we had a desperate famine. In fact, 1/3 of the population died. And after that, then, there was nothing here. People kind of had to go. Usually, the oldest girl might go to America and send back a little bit of money. And eventually, the fare would be there for another girl to go. With the result that an awful lot of girls went from Ireland to America, that they would never again be seen in their homes. They were going never to come back.
For most of the Addergoole 14, this was their first time beyond their tiny parish, their first time in large crowds of people, and their very first time sailing on a ship. Today, we can only imagine their excitement at leaving for the new world. Their bravery is inspiring. But would they survive Titanic's fate, now only 3 days away? Here in this top-secret warehouse in Atlanta lie artifacts recovered from the wreck site that reveal incredible stories of Titanic. The collection of artifacts, painstakingly maintained by the Salver in Possession of the Titanic Wreck, EMG, contains clues on the clear definition between the 3 classes on Titanic. These plates, recovered from the ocean floor, were used to serve passengers on board Titanic.
First, you have the first class here. This wasn't actually used in the dining saloon. We believe this belonged to the special service, which would have been used to serve meals in the cabins. You can see it's got a wonderful cobalt blue and gold decoration. It has the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company monogram in the center of it, and that was the parent organization of White Star Line. This decoration was able to survive immersion in the salt water, whereas the other chinas washed away, so all we can see is a haze of what they looked like. It's interesting to note that every single piece of china that were provided to the Titanic was not stamped with anything that said Titanic. So if anything says Titanic, it's a fake. This china, the blue and white Delft, was used in second class. It's a beautiful pattern that is still produced today. The decal, which was the swallowtail flag and banner for the White Star Line, you can see has faded a bit. That's because it's a decal and applied later. This is the third class ware. This is a soup bowl. They had a lot of stews and soup in third class. You have some of the staining that occurred being associated with iron objects.
Objects found near the rusting metal of Titanic often picked up staining caused by the rust.
For instance, on this one, you have the iron stain. One could try to get rid of that, but to be honest, you probably never would, because that's now into the fabric of the plate. But there are other types of treatments that can remove it so it's lessened, and that's what we've done here.
The term parish is used by the church to refer to a group of villages within a geographical area and serviced by one priest. The 14 passengers from the parish of Addergoole in Western Ireland were either related to each other or already knew each other. And for each of them, this voyage would change their lives forever.
Addergoole 14 were 14 people who decided to emigrate to America, the promised land as it is over here. They preferred to go to America rather than go to the UK. UK was kind of hard industrial scenario, whereas the America was the place to go.
You know, my uncle Pat, he was 21 years of age, and he was the 5th in a family of 7. Well, there was no work here for them. They'd only came from a very small farm, so they had to immigrate to America.
The cost of even a third-class ticket to cross the Atlantic was a huge expense for a family of modest means. It could take them months to save up enough money.
It was said that my Uncle Pat was saying goodbye to his mother, and she passed him a gold sovereign. And the sovereign slipped from his hand and it dropped to the floor, which they said at the time that was bad luck. And unfortunately, it was for him.
So the process of conservation for Titanic had to be really developed because it's considered a deep water site, and not many artifacts had been recovered from deep water sites. When an object is recovered, the process was immediately to photograph it, measure it on the expedition ship, and assign a permanent number to it. And then bag it in water from the site, and then it was transferred in seawater to a land laboratory. I think each artifact that is recovered from the wreck site of Titanic has something important to say. It may be about how something was manufactured, it might be how an object was used. First of all, I love Ireland. I think it's a beautiful country, and I think the immigration from Ireland to America greatly influenced how our country grew. This seems to me to be a small souvenir of Ireland with the shamrock. It appears to be just a small little trinket dish that you'd put on your bureau, something you might put in a window ledge. Just something to remind you of Ireland, of home, of where you came from. It's like a little touchstone for someone.
The authority went together and they thought this is a great way to do it, and it was a good idea. There were no experience of life, should we say. So going over to America was a huge challenge for them. It was such a tragedy they happened to get on to Titanic and not the Celtic the day after that, and the other liner that came in the day before. It was just pure bad luck that they landed on Titanic.
As it became clear the ship was going down, panic set in. Chaos and crowds threatened to overwhelm the Addergoole 14 as they fought their way to the lifeboat decks.
When they got to the last boat, which was lifeboat 16, and Kate Kelly got into that lifeboat.
In a way, it was a wonderful thing for us that Annie Kate got on. Because all the little stories, all the little bits and pieces that we know about the Titanic all came from Annie Kate.
And the last sight she saw was of Pat was waving goodbye to her with his rosary beads in his hand. That's the picture that's in the window, yes.
The scene was so horrifying that Annie Kate Kelly is said to have been haunted as the ship went down. It changed the direction of her life forever. In 1994, a leather satchel was retrieved from the debris field surrounding the wreck site. Conservation experts carefully worked on the objects found inside the satchel. They finally revealed the story of one couple's journey around the world. These documents also revealed that the couple's true relationship may have been considerably different than what they had led others on board to believe.
George Rosenshine and Gertrude Mapplethorne, a very interesting couple, and they certainly were a couple, but they were not married as the fact they was travelling under Mabel's name would suggest. They were both travelling under the name of Thorne.
This document is from Thomas Cook & Son, who was the travel agent for George Rosenshine and Mapplethorne. And it's from Yokohama, where they created their itineraries for the rest of their Around the World tour. It's very interesting that the paper survived, but we're very happy that it did. Number one, the paper at that time was rag paper, or better quality paper, so that helped a lot. Number two, it was recovered in leather suitcases, and the leather suitcases tended to protect the paper from the bacterial or microbial communities at the bottom of the ocean. It was very deep and dark and cold, which is another way to preserve organic material. And we have a letter from his brother on Rosenshine Brothers Stationery. And that was the business that the three brothers had, which was started by their father. Just saying family things like, we received your letters, here's one to you, we're all glad you're having a wonderful time.
Thanks to the recovery and preservation of these documents, the exciting travels of these mysterious lovers was revealed.
He was a successful businessman and she was a woman who loved travel, and so the two of them had just enjoyed a fantastic trip overseas where they'd taken in India and Japan and had, I think, thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it. And I think the suggestions are that they were very much in love.
The question is, however, if they were in love, why were they defying the Edwardian conventions of the day? Why weren't they married?
This is a curious question because as far as we know, at the time they joined Titanic, there was no obstacle. She had been married, but she, as far as we know, was no longer married. But that might have previously been a complication. There's also the factor that we're looking at an interfaith relationship, and it could be that his mother objected to him marrying out of the Jewish faith.
George and Mabel were not the only unmarried couple traveling together on the ship.
If you look at the passenger list of the Titanic, we find several instances in which there are couples either travelling as a married couple or of men who have installed their mistresses in separate cabins. And if we take that as a typical cross-section of people who were crossing the Atlantic, it seems that we see it in all three classes.
So it was a subterfuge, but it wasn't really a huge secret, other than, of course, they wouldn't tell everyone on board ship that they weren't married. They traveled as Mr. and Mrs. Thorne.
At approximately 11:40 on April 14, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg a few hundred miles off the coast of Newfoundland.
Like the majority of women who travelled first class, Mabel survived, but her partner, George, like many of the first class male passengers, did not. The telegram to George's brother that Mabel sent would suggest that Mabel was familiar with his family and in particular with his brother.
Pray God George was rescued by another boat with the rest of the men. Arrive Carpathia. Mabel Thorne.
And then I think the other telegram was to her sister, her own sister, in which she doesn't talk about George. So that may imply that her family was not aware of the relationship.
Am safe. Arrive on Cunard Carpathia. Gertrude.
Mabel survived, but what about the other female first-class passengers? Did they all survive?
Of the 144 first-class women aboard, only 4 perished in the disaster. One of the women who perished was Ida Straus. I think the story of Ida Straus is one of the most bittersweet stories of the Titanic that we know of, because she was on the verge of boarding a lifeboat.
Surrounded by chaos, shouting voices, and panic, Ida Straus stepped into a lifeboat, and yet she died. What happened to the beloved wife of Isidor Straus in the last moments of Titanic's life? Many stories have been passed down through the generations about the tragic events that unfolded after Titanic hit the iceberg. Survivors' accounts are varied and often conflict with one another. But one story that's always the same is the bittersweet tale of the final moments of Ida and Isidor Straus.
When word came down to evacuate the ship, response was mixed. It mostly depended on where you were in the ship. For instance, first class was fairly far removed from the seat of impact. Many people said they didn't feel anything. Many first-class passengers were reluctant to actually evacuate. Titanic was warm and steady, and the lights didn't even blink. The feeling was, in many cases, it's the officers being overly protective, overly judicious. Now, in third class, where you're much closer to the impact, it was rather different. The ship actually did rattle, and many third-class passengers, especially the forward end of the ship, were very much aware that something was wrong, and they were very anxious to make their way to the top deck. Women and children first was a long-standing tradition. It's not codified anywhere. It was just the way gentlemen were expected to behave. It's no miracle that most first-class women survived. The lifeboats were on the first-class deck. Everybody knew how to get up to them, so most of them survived. Now, 4 first-class women did not survive. The most famous of these is Ida Straus.
When Titanic sank, they sent up flares and they sent out radio signals. And as it happened, there was a ship called Carpathia that was traveling in the other direction. And aboard this ship was a grocery buyer from Macy's called John Badenoch.
Dear Mr. Percy, as per your request, I submit herewith the facts as desired.
He wrote a very lengthy letter to one of the sons, Percy, describing the scene.
Realizing how anxious you would be to get the most accurate information about the last that was seen of your father and mother, I circulated among the survivors.
From this, we have really a very good understanding of what happened aboard Titanic in the very last moments with regard to the Strauses.
Ida entered one of the lifeboats, expecting that her husband would join her. She turned around and found that he was not coming into the lifeboat. She said, "Please, Isidor," and he said, "No, it's women and children first." She then said, "If you are not going to be in the lifeboat, I shall not be in the lifeboat. We have lived a wonderful life together, and in keeping with the spirit of the book of Ruth, where thou go, I go, and if need be, we will perish together."
Your mother was asked by the officer in charge and urged by your father to get in one of the lifeboats. She refused to do so and insisted that the maid take her place in boat number 8.
She saw her maid and said, "Ellen, you must now get in to the lifeboat, but you will be cold in these frigid, iceberg-laden seas. I have no further need for this fur coat, and let me give it to you to keep you warm in the lifeboat until you're rescued." She had lived this wonderful life with Isidor, who loved her as much as she loved him, and that as they had lived their lives together, so they would perish together, in love, in each other's arms.
Your father and mother then walked to the opposite side of the ship, and when last seen were standing, clasped in each other's arms, calmly awaiting for any help that might come.
That form of death, I think, has not only perhaps a generosity, but to me, simply a beauty to it.
A lot of people died that night. I think you'd be very sorry to see a soul like Mrs. Straus go with them.
So Ellen Burr did survive, and after she came to New York, she brought the coat to their eldest daughter.
And that would be Sarah Straus Hess, my grandmother. And I remember I said to my grandmother, "So what did you say to Ellen?" And she said, "My mother gave this coat to you. This coat is yours. I want you to have it in my mother's memory.
Word didn't get back for way over a week later.
My relative was Annie McGowan. She was a cousin of my mother's. She got on a lifeboat and she was lucky to be saved.
Of the 14 people who left from Addergoole, 11 died in the disaster and only 3 survived. The tragedy had long-term effects on the community.
It was an awful blow. My uncle, he never wanted to hear anything about the Titanic afterwards. Like if there was any mention of it, you could see the sadness in his face and his eyes would well up with tears. He didn't want to hear it. And that was the feeling all over.
Well, my grandmother was Pat's mother. When she went to bed, she was so depressed that she was in bed for a week or so after.
Of the 3 survivors, Annie Kate Kelly was the only one who ever returned to Ireland. After the disaster, she joined her sister and cousins in Chicago, where she became a nun and devoted her life to service. To honor their unique connection to the tragedy, the parish of Addergoole erected this memorial park in time for the 100th anniversary of Titanic's sinking.
It was traumatic. And that is why the Titanic Society was formed here in Athergole, that collectively, as a community, would remember those 14 people. Now, everything which was built here in the Memorial Park was built from stones from the homes of the 14 people.
After my great-grandparents died, a memorial service was held for them in the city. The turnout was so great, they simply could not accommodate everyone who wanted to be there. And thousands came to pay tribute to my great-grandparents.
To me, what's really dramatic is that if you research the outpouring of New York society when learning of their deaths, it's amazing. Every group that they ever gave money to, all their employees, everyone wrote to the family to express their grief over having lost this wonderful couple.
In Macy's, a plaque was erected by the employees, and this is the beautiful part. It was not by the members of the board of directors, it was not by shareholders. It's the employees through their employee association with literally nickels and dimes who raised the money to have a plaque of Isidor and Ida to be placed in the main entrance on 34th Street.
Dr. Paul Nolan came up with the idea of having an annual bell-ringing ceremony to remember the Addergoole 14 while sitting in the pub.
So I went across, got a ladder and got a rope, came around, and eventually got the ladder up and tied it on there and fell down off my back and all that. And then said, "Bugger this," so I pulled it a few times and it rang. So then I went back into the 2 pubs. I said, "Come on, we're all going to come up with me and we're going to ring a bell. We're going to ring a bell and we're going to have the noise going across the whole lake and around the mountain. We're going to ring the bell. This is our day."
Internationally recognized Titanic expert Alex Klingelhofer has traveled to Ireland to share artifacts recovered from the Titanic wreck site with relatives of the Addergoole 14.
Thank you for coming this evening. It's my pleasure to be here. And I have one artifact that I brought that shows the extension of the Irish culture throughout the world. So it's a small little piece of art pottery. It has the shamrock on it. And so I thought that would be at least speaking to the Irish culture that so changed the world. I mean, I know in America, where I'm from, the Irish started coming in the mid-19th century, and they really changed the landscape of our culture, and so they're very important to us. So I was trying to think of something that would really speak to the 14. So I thought about their daily lives. What did they do every day? They had tea. What did they do on Titanic? They had tea. These are third-class teacups. It's just a cup, but it can remind us of the larger story of the Addergoole 14. Maybe one of your people held this. Maybe one of your people drank from it. You are keeping these stories alive, and therefore the legacy of Titanic alive, and that's important. And I'm glad you all came together, because learning from you about the 14 who were on Titanic, it's important. They're not just names on a memorial wall, but they actually have some sort of view of their life behind that name.
It was such a sad, terrible thing to happen that each family lost a relative, was absolutely saddened. But then some years ago, when we came together and formed the society, the whole community now expresses their loss.
Memorials like these have played an important role to honor and remember those who were lost on Titanic.
Boats went out and recovered many of the bodies that were floating on the sea, including my great-grandfather Isidor's, but they did not ever recover Ida's body. Isidor was brought back, and they found in the vest that he was wearing a locket. And that locket was given to my mother, who in turn gave it to me. It's a small locket that is gold with an onyx face with the initials I.S. Isidor Straus engraved. Inside the locket, 2 pictures, one of his eldest son, Jesse, and one of his eldest daughter, Sarah, my grandmother. And this will remain as an item by promise throughout the generations of our family. People have sometimes asked me, if it were you, would you have made the decision that Isidor did? And I have to say, I don't know, but I'd like to think I would.
Oh, the water is black, and my heart is somewhere in the sea.
Well, tonight, a group of people will get together at about 2 o'clock in the morning.
On the night Titanic sailed.
There'll be a candlelight procession right round the church.
Sat by the fireside.
There'll be a few words spoken, few prayers said to remember those people who are so tragically lost.
My love waits for me.
Now, the ship was sinking from 2:20 until 2:45. So the relatives of the 11 who were lost will each go to the church bell.
Firstly, I would like to call on Frank Gibbons, who will toll the bell for John Burke. I invite Tommy Canavan to ring the bell for Pat Canavan.
Now, that has been done every year for quite a number of years. And hopefully that the community will continue to do that and remember those people for many years to come.
The sinking of RMS Titanic is distant history, yet to some, it is as relevant today as love. You see, love and the loss of love has no expiry date. This collection of artifacts reminds us, inspires us, that in the face of enormous tragedy, in the end, love is what remains.
Titanic lookout Frederick Fleet survived the disaster. So why did he come to a terrible end? What is the heartbreaking story of the man who spotted the iceberg?
And who were the seemingly orphaned children saved in the last lifeboat? Where were their parents? Then there is the fascinating story of the man at the wheel when the ship hit the iceberg. The tragic journey of Robert Hitchens. All this on Titanic, Stories from the Deep.
The wreck of RMS Titanic was discovered 3,800 meters deep in the Atlantic Ocean. Over 5,500 artifacts and personal items have since been recovered, all reminders of the passengers and crew who set sail that fateful day. These objects tell very real stories of love, survival, mystery, and fate. This is Titanic, Stories from the Deep.
It's the year 2000. In the North Atlantic Ocean, 12,500 feet below the surface, Russian submersible Mir 1 scans the debris field of the Titanic. Previous dives had found artifacts representing key moments from the night of the sinking. The crow's nest bell, which rang 3 times after spotting the iceberg, and the crow's nest telephone, which was used to communicate this danger to the bridge. Amongst the sand and debris, Mir 1 spots a metal object. It's revealed to be a brass steering stand.
At a stand like this one stood Quartermaster Robert Hitchens.
That night of April 14th, 1912, turning the wheel hard to starboard, attempting to outmaneuver a deadly iceberg. Hitchens' attempt to evade the iceberg's path proved futile. Only 37 seconds after the infamous words, "iceberg right ahead," the Titanic's fate was sealed. World-renowned Titanic conservator Alex Klingelhofer describes the journey the steering stand took from the bottom of the ocean to this top-secret warehouse in Atlanta.
This artifact was brought to the surface and then conserved and treated. The piece itself weighs about 80 pounds. This is made out of bronze. This piece would have been vertical. So the wheel would have been attached here, and the quartermaster would have stood here. And basically, he's in charge of the helm, so he's the one that's controlling where the ship goes.
For some crew members, the decisions they made would be forever tried in the court of public opinion. And few people in Titanic lore are as controversial as Quartermaster Robert Hitchens.
He was the man that was at the ship's wheel during the collision, which is the biggest reason that people recognize him. And then the second biggest reason would be the fame of his interactions with Molly Brown, the lifeboat.
Margaret, or Molly Brown, was a socialite traveling without her husband. Following the tragedy, she became known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. As Titanic was being evacuated, she was seated in Lifeboat 6.
After the iceberg was struck, Hitchens was sent to help with evacuations. He was put in charge of Lifeboat number 6.
Captain Smith, at some point along the way into the sinking, had a megaphone and tried calling some of the lifeboats that were only partially filled back to the ship to take on more people. And Hitchens heard this order and refused to go back.
As the Titanic sank, a lot of women in the boats, hearing the cries of distress, wanted to return. And Hitchens, he said, "It's our lives now, not theirs," and was accused of saying that there were only a lot of stiffs back there.
Quite a few of these women in this boat had left their husbands or friends back behind. At that stage, he could have gone back and possibly taken on people safely and refused to do it.
They row away and eventually tie up with boat number 16, rafting together. Hitchens then stood down from his station and prepared to take a rest. As soon as they stopped rowing, the women in the boats began to chill down and they found the cold intolerable and they wanted to resume rowing so they could remain warm. Hitchens objected. Margaret Brown, absolutely incensed.
She threatened him and said, "We're going to do this anyways, and if you try to stop me, I'm going to throw you overboard."
One of the women had to put their hand on Margaret's shoulder to try and settle her down, but she said later, "Oh no, if I tried to advance on him, he was so terrified of me, he would have gone overboard."
You know, you've got Molly Brown, she's on the stage in books, on mugs, and everybody loves her and sees her as this incredible heroine. And Robert Hitchens is this terrible bully, and it's not true.
The first ship to respond to Titanic's rescue call was the RMS Carpathia. A flare from a lifeboat in the distance caught the crew's attention, and Carpathia spent the rest of the night picking up passengers from the lifeboats. At approximately 8 a.m., lifeboat number 6 rowed up to the Carpathia, one of the last to be rescued.
It was a wonderful scene on the Carpathia where Margaret Brown and some of the other passengers of lifeboat number 6 come across Hitchens apparently gesticulating wildly and talking about the difficulties he had in installing discipline in his lifeboat. And of course he looked up and saw Margaret Brown and her little entourage, and at that point he beat a hasty retreat.
Robert Hitchens' great-granddaughter, Sally Nielsen, began her research into Hitchens' life as a young girl.
I was 14 and I hadn't heard about Robert Hitchens. My grandfather, Alf, he'd be sat in a corner with his woodbines and his pale ale. And I was just sat talking to him one day and he said, "Did you know your great-grandfather, he was at the wheel of the Titanic when it hit the iceberg?" And I thought, well, that is an amazing story. So I started getting interested. And then I suddenly thought, we're going to be 2012 soon. Nothing's really been written about my great-grandfather, and his story has been so one-sided.
Before the 100th anniversary of the sinking, Sally published a book, The Man Who Sank Titanic.
I thought, somebody's got to tell the story, and it's going to be me. Robert was born in New Lynn. He went out to sea when he was 14. Robert said, "I want to make something of myself." And so he said goodbye to his family and he joined the Royal Naval Reserves. And he becomes a quartermaster. Quartermaster has quite a lot of duties, but of course they steer the ship. It was while he was on shore leave that he met a farm labourer's daughter, and her name was Florence Mortimer. And he fell in love, love blossomed, and they got married in about 1906. And it was 1910 that Robert decided, I need to further my career now, and I want to be on the big liners. And the nearest port was Southampton. Southampton was a bustling sea town. It didn't become a city until the 60s. This wall shows all the 900 crew that were on Titanic. And there's hardly any photos. I'm just trying to find Robert Hitchens here, actually. And there were only about 165 who did survive. There he is. 1912, it was a terrible time. There were the coal strikes. Anything that ran on coal, so specifically the steamships were having a terrible time. So every single crewman was trying to get on a ship. When the coal strike was lifted on the 6th of April, they went charging down to the signing on offices to try and get on this fantastic ship that they'd heard about. He was 29 when he signed up at Southampton on the 6th of April. The paint was hardly even dry when Titanic came to Southampton from Belfast. Robert went down there with hundreds of other hopefuls, and he was the second quartermaster, actually, to sign up after the officers. The coal strike had meant that Southampton had been in terrible poverty, and now, at last, he had a berth on a ship and an opportunity to make some money. He was 12 years as a quartermaster before he went on Titanic. And Titanic was going to be the first ship that he was to sail on with the White Star Line. Florence, his beloved wife, she was 6 months pregnant with my grandmother, Phyllis May. And his parents and his family were so proud that he was going to be sailing on this fantastic luxury liner. It was just terribly, terribly exciting.
In the port city of Southampton, England, Robert Hitchens' great-granddaughter, Sally Nilsson, visits berth 44.
There would have been a very big terminal building. It's changed so much.
At noon on April 10th, 1912, Titanic departed from this spot on her maiden voyage to New York.
If I imagine really, really hard, I can see the bands and, you know, all the passengers throwing all the roses over the boat deck of the Titanic and the whistles blowing. And I imagine the huge, great, heavy bronze propellers turning. Yeah, I can definitely imagine it.
Riding in the lap of luxury, it had been 4 days of smooth sailing for passengers of Titanic. Cruising along at a brisk speed of 23 knots, Titanic had so far lived up to the hype of her launch. But on the morning of April 14th, a series of troubling telegrams were received.
Days leading up to Titanic, there were so many reports of ships getting stuck in ice. It's all different types of icebergs. So they were heading at 22.5 knots towards a known ice field. Sunday, the 14th of April, and Robert Hitchens starts the shift at 8 o'clock. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were up in the crow's nest, which is just in front of the pilot house, 50 feet up, and Robert was at the wheel. So Robert Hitchens, he's at the wheel, and he hears a bell. 3 loud gongs of the bell up from the crow's nest. All of a sudden, all hell breaks loose. Moody comes racing into the wheelhouse. The phone rings. He picks up the phone and he says, "What do you see?" And from the crow's nest, it would be ice dead ahead. And then William Murdoch says, "Ice dead ahead, hard to starboard." And it's at that point that Robert Hitchens flings the wheel to the left. And it was as Robert Hitchens was just going 2 points to try and steer to port again that they hit.
As Titanic turned to port, it very nearly avoided the iceberg altogether. In fact, the collision was along the starboard side at intermittent intervals. But the pressure of the berg against the hull plates caused them to buckle and open to the sea, which of course allowed the ingress of water. Once they'd breached 6 watertight compartments, it was inevitable that the ship would sink.
Captain Smith comes out at that point from his cabin and he says, "What have we hit?" So Murdoch says, "We've hit an iceberg. You know, I hard to starboarded, I tried to port round her, but it was too late. We already hit."
This is the crow's nest bell, rung by 24-year-old lookout Frederick Fleet after spotting the iceberg. Fleet and shift partner Reginald Lee started their watch in the crow's nest at 10 p.m. It was a clear, starry night. The water was still, no chop. One witness described it as looking at a sea of glass. It wasn't until 11:39 p.m. when Fleet first glimpsed the large black mass in their path.
It was the beautifulest night I'd ever seen. The stars were like lamps. I saw this black thing looming up. I didn't know what it was. I asked Lee if he knew what it was. He couldn't say. I thought I'd better ring the bell. I rang it 3 times. We watched the thing. It had a pointed top. We didn't like the look of this thing.
After ringing the bell, Fleet picked up his phone and called the wheelhouse. where 6th Officer James Moody answered the call. Iceberg right ahead. The officers had only 37 seconds to act. About 20 minutes after impact, Frederick Fleet ended his shift in the Crow's Nest. He was sent down to the boat deck to help with evacuations and directed to assist Quartermaster Robert Hitchens in loading passengers safely into lifeboat number 6.
Robert had 25 in his lifeboat, 21 women and 4 men. It was really difficult because they're big, heavy wooden lifeboats. And Robert Hitchens said, take an oar, ladies and oar, do your best. And then they rowed and rowed as hard as they could so that they were nearly a mile away from the Titanic. And then they looked back. And they could see the Titanic upend and go into the water. It must have been the most horrific thing for all of them to have seen. Absolutely terrible. It was that got the women to trying to persuade Robert Hitchens to go back for survivors. They could hear the moaning in the water. This is where Robert Hitchens' reputation was absolutely ruined. This is the whole point of the story and me wanting to tell his story, because one of the passengers was Margaret Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown. And later on, Robert would say, this woman, she could have gone into any lifeboat. Why, oh, why did she come into mine? They were all in terrible shock. You know, the women, they had husbands on board the Titanic. But Molly Brown was on her own. She didn't have her husband and her children on the ship. So she took charge because she could. You know, she was a socialite. She was a woman that got things done. And she was loud. She was saying, go back for survivors. And Robert was saying, no, he knows how cold the water is. He knows about hypothermia. He knows that if you go in the water, you're not going to survive. I have no doubt that Robert used, you know, quite flowery language. I don't know exactly what he would have said. And somebody said Molly Brown was even trying to sort of climb over and get to the tiller. But if you'd just been at the helm of a major luxury unsinkable liner and it had hit an iceberg, how would you be feeling? There was no way he was going to let go of that tiller. He was probably in terrible shock. They were saying that he was quivering like an aspen. He just had an overcoat on, he had no hat. He'd been standing up, his lips were getting frostbitten. He wanted to make sure that he could steer these people to safety. Passengers within the lifeboat were calling him a bully, and they were saying he was a coward because he didn't go back for survivors. And that is it. That was his reputation for 100 years, that he was a coward and a bully. They wanted someone to blame. That was it. And Robert was the one.
Almost an hour after Robert Hitchens' lifeboat number 6 launched successfully from Titanic, the lifeboat Collapsible D is lowered down from the roof of the officers' quarters. There were 4 collapsible lifeboats on the Titanic, launched after the 16 standard wooden lifeboats were deployed. With 1,500 people still aboard, and only a 47-passenger limit on Collapsible D, crew members form a circle around it to ensure only women and children get on board. All of a sudden, a Frenchman breaks through the human barrier with 2 small boys in hand. They're safely placed aboard, and Collapsible D launches from the port side. It would be the last lifeboat to leave successfully. When the Carpathia came to their rescue, the boys spoke no English and didn't know the names of their parents. When they got to New York, the newspapers proclaimed them the Titanic orphans. Who were these children? The range of artifacts recovered from Titanic's resting place can lead us to contemplate some of the saddest aspects of the tragedy. These are some clay marbles found at the debris site. One can imagine children rolling them down the Titanic's long promenade decks. There were 126 children aboard Titanic under the age of 14, and almost half of them would perish the night of the sinking. The so-called Titanic orphans would survive the tragedy. In Paris, France, Elisabeth Navratil discusses her connection to one of the biggest mysteries of the Titanic story.
Quand j'étais jeune, donc, nous vivions à Montpellier, et une nuit, j'entends mes parents parler et j'entends le mot Titanic. J'ai dit, mais de quoi vous parlez? Ils ont hésité, et puis papa a décidé de me raconter ce qui s'était passé. Et tout d'un coup, j'ai compris pourquoi mon grand-père était mort.
Mon grand-père, Michel Navratil,
il fait un apprentissage de couture à Vienne. Et ensuite, il va se perfectionner à Paris. Et ensuite, il est engagé par le meilleur tailleur de Nice. Et il devient le premier tailleur. Là, il y a une jeune fille qui est apprentie couturière, Marcel. Il tombe immédiatement amoureux de cette jeune fille et elle de lui. Ils se marient, ils ont 2 ans de bonheur, mais aussi ils ne s'entendent pas sur tous les points.
The couple has 2 children in quick succession, but their relationship starts to break down.
C'est Marcel et les 2 enfants, l'année où elle est infidèle, je pense. Quand Michel apprend qu'il est trompé par son meilleur ami avec sa femme, il devient fou de colère et fou de désespoir.
Michel, in a fit of rage, decides to end his marriage and immigrate to Chicago, where he has family, and takes his children with him.
Il ne peut pas imaginer de laisser ses enfants à Marcel. Il est allé à Monte-Carlo acheter 3 billets de seconde classe sur le Titanic. Et il s'est inscrit sous le nom de son ami Michel Hoffman. Ensuite, il va à Southampton directement parce qu'il a peur d'être arrêté par la police.
Michel Navratil has kidnapped his 2 young sons and fled France.
Years later, Michel's eldest son, Michel Marcel Navratil Jr., wrote down his memories of escaping the sinking ship.
Je fus réveillée par mon père. Il me porta dans ses bras sur le pont du Titanic, puis tous 2 nous placèrent, mon frère et moi, dans un canot qui était déjà à peu près pleine de passagers. Mon père me chargea de dire à ma mère l'affection qu'il avait pour elle, et il nous quitta. Je ne savais pas que je ne le reverrais plus. Je me souviens des moments où la barque fut descendue du Titanic, du bruit qu'elle fit en tombant dans l'eau, et des moments où elle commença à s'éloigner du navire. Je me souviens de mon réveil dans la barque, après que je me sois endormie. La mer était blanchâtre, presque livide, et il y avait un navire à distance. C'était le Carpathia.
Once aboard the rescue ship, no one could figure out who the children were or where their parents may be.
Les enfants ne connaissent pas leur nom de famille. Ils ne connaissent même pas leur prénom parce qu'on les appelle Lolo pour Michel et Moumou pour Edmond.
It was impossible for the authorities to determine who they were and if they had any living relatives. Numerous stories and photos of the boys appeared in newspapers around the world, creating an international mystery. In the meantime, their mother had no clue where they were.
Au bout de 5 jours, après le naufrage, elle voit sur le journal de Nice la photo en grand de ses enfants, rescapés du Titanic. Voilà.
Marcel convinces the White Star Line to give her a ticket to New York, and she sets off to reunite with her children.
Lorsqu'elle arrive là-bas, à la Children Aid Society, elle entre, les enfants sont à l'autre bout, en train de jouer, et puis il la voit, et tout le monde court, et ils se rejoignent au centre. Et là, c'est des baisers, des mamans et des mamans. Bon, bref. Ça y est, on lui rend ses enfants. Voilà.
Michel Navratil Sr., the young boy's father, perished in the sinking. His body was recovered and he was buried in a Halifax cemetery, along with many others from the maritime disaster. Elizabeth's father, Michel Marcel Navratil Jr., died in 2001 at the age of 92. He was the last living male survivor of Titanic. After the rescue, survivors were brought back to New York. United States Senator William Alden Smith formed an official inquiry into the sinking of Titanic. On day 5 of the proceedings, Robert Hitchens was called to testify.
In the inquiry, he claims nobody asked him to go back to pick anybody out of the water, says he didn't use the term stiffs, that kind of thing.
A lot of his answers when he was challenged on these points seemed to revolve around, well, I don't remember, I don't recall saying that, which of course is classic evasion.
In the age of yellow journalism, and you needed a good story, disreputable reporters would just stitch stories together, and that's what was printed.
Margaret Brown had some very scathing things to say about Hitchens to the press. She talked about him as being craven and wouldn't even call him a man. She considered him the epitome of cowardice.
She was saying all this stuff that he was preaching and quivering and looking terrified, and he was a coward and a bully.
Somebody like Hitchens is just going to take the black eye, because if you start making a stink about it, then the stink becomes the story. What might have been read by a few thousand people in a provincial paper is now read by everybody.
So Robert Hitchens was asked to testify. Once he'd told the actual story, the timeline of everything that he did, he said, "I do want to add something, sir." You know, he wanted to give his side of the story. People are saying that, you know, I stole all the brandy and I was drunk and that I wouldn't go back for survivors. And that's just not the case. I was given direct orders. I was just doing my job. Nobody at any point said it was Robert's fault. But if you've been at the helm of a luxury unsinkable liner and it sinks, you know, it was like he had an albatross sitting on his shoulder, and people didn't want to sail with him anymore. So for many years, he did sail a little bit, but on small ships. You know, there were many seamen who they went out to sea all their lives. It was all they knew. And that was certainly Robert. You know, he went out to sea when he was 14, and his whole life he was part of the sea in one continent or another.
Hitchens' life after the Titanic was a troubled one, including time in prison for attempted murder.
We're getting towards the Great Depression, and Florence was running a B&B with her sister in a very posh part of Torquay. So Robert had this boat, but no one had any money. And then they had a really bad summer of rain as well. So Robert wasn't getting any of the people coming on his boat. But he also made a very silly mistake of borrowing some money from a man called Harry Henley. He was not a very likable character. Harry Henley wanted his money back, and he was giving Robert a really, really hard time and bullying him. And Robert was in such a terrible state, he had to sell the house, and he blamed Harry Henley. So he was going to kill Harry Henley, and he was going to kill himself. And he found Harry Henley, and Robert said, "Lend me some money." And Harry Henley said, "If you weren't so drunk, I'd beat you up." So Robert Hitchens reached into his pocket and he took out the gun, this small silver revolver, and he shot him.
The shot barely grazed Henley's skull, and a second shot missed completely. Henley escaped and ran to the police. Hitchens tried to end his own life, but that shot missed as well.
But because of his excellent war record and the fact that he was on the Titanic and he was down and out, he didn't get the hangman noose. But he was given 5 years at Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight.
Even after his release from prison, Robert Hitchens' struggles continued.
Florence was suffering with headaches and she was diagnosed with a brain tumour. She died in early 1940. Robert went to Liverpool and picked up the English trader and took his last trip. And he was telling crewmen on the English trader, I won't see England again, I want to be with Florence. And, you know, Robert died on the 23rd of September.
His family never found out where he was buried, but it was assumed he was buried at sea.
There's a wonderful photograph of him on the beach with Florence and her sister. You can see how much taller she is than him. Robert's standing there with a pipe. And I love that photograph. That is the... You see, that's what gets me. Sorry, because that's Robert. I just see him. I see him. It's like he's standing in front of me when I see that photo. You know, that is the kind, caring Robert. You know, he's probably got a great sense of humour and the one that his parents loved and, you know, everyone else seemed to love, except for the people that were in the lifeboat.
At the Senate inquiry in New York after the sinking, the young lookout who spotted the iceberg, Frederick Fleet, was also called to testify. His answers were terse and short.
Every crew member who survived faced questioning to some degree or another. It might have been more acute in his case just simply because of the position he occupied, the position he was in when the collision occurred.
The questions are pretty straightforward, most of them what he's asking, but it did seem like he was being maybe slightly evasive or at least defensive in his responses. When they asked, how quickly did you see that? He's like, well, I told them about it as soon as I saw it. And you could tell he didn't want to get blamed about not reporting it soon enough.
They've just experienced the most catastrophic accident that the North Atlantic has ever seen. And he was the lookout. I think it's very natural that you would feel defensive. You would feel very vulnerable in that position. But he was a sensitive soul, and I think he might have read as criticism what wasn't necessarily intended as criticism.
Questions started to arise as to why the lookouts weren't equipped with binoculars, or glasses, as they were then called.
Will you tell me how long have you been of the rank of lookout? How long have you held that position?
About 4 years. All the time I was in the Oceanic.
When you were in the Oceanic and employed there as a lookout, did you have glasses?
Yes.
Glasses provided for you in the crow's nest?
Yes, every trip.
Did you ask for glasses?
I did not, but Simmons did.
You had better tell us what he said.
He said there were none aboard for us.
There could very well have been a set of binoculars in the crow's nest locker. The trouble was, the door was locked, and the man who had the key had been let go.
Now, we know that they did have binoculars when they brought Titanic from Belfast to Southampton.
One officer was placed in charge of the binoculars in a locked cabinet. You would always keep everything locked. But the last day before they set sail, there was a change in the order of the officers.
David Blair, the second officer, left the ship in Southampton. There was a reshuffle. A new chief officer was brought on board. He left the ship with the key to the crow's nest box in his pocket.
Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, normally they would have taken binoculars with them, but there were none to be provided because they were locked up and unavailable to them.
Do you think if you had had glasses, you could have seen the iceberg sooner?
Certainly.
How much sooner do you think you could have seen it?
In time for the ship to get out of the way.
So it is your view that if you had had glasses, it would have made all the difference between safety and disaster?
Yes.
Fleet's explosive claim that binoculars could have changed Titanic's fate caused a stir. But whether it's actually true has been hotly debated by historians.
Experienced merchant seamen themselves couldn't agree on the merits of carrying binoculars.
Some lookouts favored having binoculars, but a lot of them didn't like using them, especially at night.
Binoculars magnified the object they were looking at, but of course they restricted your field of view. So in the view of some merchant mariners, it was better to have a clear, unencumbered view of the horizon.
Apparently, Admiral Scott of Antarctica said that no, actually, in his opinion, being on the deck with binoculars would have been much better to observe an iceberg in those conditions. But to be honest, no one will ever know. Just the fact that there weren't binoculars and that Frederick Fleet saw the absence of stars and rang the bell and said iceberg straight ahead.
After the disaster, Frederick Fleet had trouble finding steady work aboard other ships. There were numerous rumors that perhaps Titanic's crew were bad luck.
After the Titanic, he kind of felt that he had gotten a raw deal because of his affiliation with the sinking, and I think a lot of the crew members felt that way, that maybe they got kind of passed out because they didn't want reminders about the sinking.
There are some indications that there was a certain stigma with having been a Titanic crewman. I interviewed the son of a White Star Line steward who said that in the 1930s there was a suggestion that the careers, at least of the Titanic's officers, had been stymied.
Fleet's life didn't get easier in the ensuing years. The memories of the tragedy still haunted him.
Frederick Fleet struggled for many years after the Titanic disaster. He had insomnia. He spoke years later of the continuing nightmare of seeing this giant dark shape looming out of the dark. What we know now about survivor's guilt is that regardless of what your roles or responsibilities are, just by virtue of the fact that you survive can leave you riddled with feelings of guilt. He spent the last days of his life selling newspapers in Southampton. He met an extremely unfortunate end. His beloved wife, Eva, died. He was already struggling. They'd been living in his brother-in-law's house. Upon the death of his wife, he was evicted.
So he was destitute and poor. He was corresponding with Ed Commuta from Titanic Historical Society and had actually kind of talked about these bad circumstances in his life and how hard off he was at that point.
My dear friend, just a few lines to let you know I'm in deep trouble. I have just lost my wife. Also, I'm leaving my house, the place where I have been living. There is only my brother-in-law and myself. We cannot agree, so I think it is to let you know not to write me until I give you my new address.
Within a week, he had snuck back into his old home and he hanged himself in the backyard. I think the Titanic followed him his whole life. Right up to the time he died, he felt very keenly that the Titanic followed him to his grave.
The really horrible thing is that when he died, because he was so poor, he was buried in a pauper's grave, was unmarked.
But in 1993, Ed Commuta and the Titanic Historical Society raised funds to have a tombstone erected for Fleet at Hollybrook Cemetery in Southampton. In Aberdeen, Scotland, at Trinity Cemetery, Robert Hitchens' great-granddaughter, Sally Nilsson, meets with City Council officer Ian Burnett.
They thought that Robert was buried at sea. They didn't know where he was, and lots of family members tried to find him. They couldn't find him. But then in 2012, 2 weeks before the anniversary, I just thought, I've got to give it my last-ditch attempt to find Robert. And I was calling councils, libraries, everybody.
There were tentacles of information and I couldn't find it anywhere else. So it was that second phone call when I spoke to Ian. And I said, Ian, please, can you just have one more look?
I didn't even know who Robert Hitchens was, you know. I mean, I just said that I couldn't find him. And then she come back and then she said to me, do you know who he was? You know, and I said, no. And that's where she told me it was the helmsman of the Titanic, you know.
you phoned me and you said something on the lines of, Sally, you're not going to believe this.
Yeah.
And I said, what? And you said, I found him.
Yeah.
I think I might burst into tears, actually. You told me that within this little area here, there's 3 seamen.
Yeah. So it's the company that actually bought the grave and paid for the burial for convenience. You know, if they're working for the company, almost a benefit or a perk to get them buried, not in a pauper's grave.
I quite like the idea that Robert's not on his own, though.
Yeah,
he's got some mates down there.
He's got some shipmates down there.
Sally is raising money to erect a proper stone marker. In the meantime, a homemade cross will have to do.
I just really, really hope that he's happy and he's got a little smile on his face, that, you know, some little minion were able to tell the proper story, you know, the real story about Robert Hitchens, that he was just doing his duty. So hopefully, in some small way, I've done it.
In a top-secret warehouse in Atlanta, Sally Nielsen is about to see the brass steering stand recovered from Titanic's wreck site, similar to the one her great-grandfather used on the night of the sinking.
Hi.
Hi, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great, nice to see you.
Good to see you.
You ready for this?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay.
Very excited.
Yes, here we go. Here we are. That's it.
Wow. Oh my gosh, there's wooden spokes out of it as well.
It's amazing that it's still here. Of course, it would have stood about this high, so it would have been quite large. And this is where the wheel would have been.
Yeah.
So your great-grandfather would have stood behind there and turned the wheel.
Oh my
at that
God.
point. And if you notice here, it says port. It's inscribed port.
Oh, yes.
And then there's a bar and it's starboard over here. And of course, you know, when he did he was asked to turn hard to starboard.
Yeah.
So he would have gone to this direction.
Wow. Just to see this it's such a special thing. I mean, this links me to my great-grandfather and it's too much almost. Yeah. It's funny, sorry.
It's okay.
I knew I'd be emotional about this, but
Of course.
it is just so incredible.
Yeah.
I can't believe that's come from the Titanic. I just feel so completely privileged and grateful. Amazing. Just absolutely amazing. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
And sharing your story with us.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Thank you.
Titanic's sinking left no mark on the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. But in the sea of life, many of her survivors knew the mark of Titanic's sinking until their dying day.